Floridian by birth and a violinist by early training. The folk revival drew him into studying folklore and music, folk music as a graduate student at Duke University in the 1960s, when he documented and apprenticed with old-time fiddlers in the Upper South. He taught at UCLA before becoming head of the Archive of Folk Song at the Library of Congress from the years 1969 to 74, director of folk arts at the National Endowment for the Arts from 74 to 76, and director of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, a position he held from 1976 to 1999. A longtime performer of and writer about folk music, he has returned to folk activities enthusiastically since his retirement. So bringing you out of retirement and on your birthday, boy, we really owe you a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Am I on? I don't think I am on. Am I on? Yes, I'm on. It's good being here. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me, Esther. And I'm going to talk and play the fiddle in about equal parts tonight, and I hope I won't trail it on too long, but I'd like to convey to you some of my experiences with old-time fiddling and some of the thoughts that it led me to, because when you start these things as a young man or woman, you have all sorts of notions in your mind of what folk music is, and in the course of time, your experiences reinforce some of the things you originally thought, but a lot of them are broken down and reassembled in a new way. And so I'll tell you a little about some of the things I either learned or started thinking about fiddling over the years. I started playing violin, as Esther said, in primary school. There was actually a program in primary school that taught string music, and so they led me in third grade to this room, and there were some young people scratching away on the fiddle and the viola and the cello, and they said, "Would you like to do this?" And I said, "Yes, I'd love to." And they said, "Well, which one would you like to play?" And you have to bear in mind that at that time I was not 6 feet 6 inches tall, and so I didn't know that I should have chosen the cello at the very least, you know. And so I chose the fiddle, and I played it all my life and ended up playing professionally in high school and sort of put myself through college playing music. But when you're in something early enough, maybe you see the seamy side of it, I don't know. And I decided I wanted to do something else when I grew up. And so though I used music to get myself through college, I didn't major in music. Something more practical. How about English literature? You know, so I majored in English and played music, and then went off to graduate school in 1963, thinking that I would become a medievalist. I was at Duke University, and one of the first courses I took was a course in the ballad, a seminar in the ballad for graduate students, taught by a professor there, Holger Nygaard. And Holger got me deeply interested in folk balladry, folk song, and not only did I get interested in it from a literary point of view, but he dragged out Library of Congress recordings and played them for the classes, and so I was smitten. It was like a breath of fresh air to hearing this music, these field recordings done by people in the field in different parts of the South and the North and the British Isles. I got all excited about these traditional recordings that were made by scholars going out into the field. And I thought to myself, well, if all these collectors went out and collected folk songs and folk stories and folklore of various sorts, I played the violin all my life, I could go and collect folk fiddle playing. And so I bought a cheap tape recorder, and out I went to be a recordist, just like the people that I learned about in the ballad seminar from the Library of Congress recordings. And I went right out into Durham County, North Durham County, right where I was at Duke University. And you know, a fiddle is a public art. When you play the fiddle, it's not a secret in your community. People are well aware of who the fiddle players are, you know. And so I would stop in country stores and I would ask, is there any fiddle players around here? And presumably they sized me up a little bit, but pretty soon they volunteered. I said I was interested in learning more about and finding and recording traditional fiddling. So I went, pretty soon I found myself at the door of the fiddlers that were my quest. It was almost too easy. There I was. But they were very friendly. Now people, when I started this quest, talked about it, and they would say, well, now when you go out to those country people, you got to be careful because they're a little suspicious of out-of-towners and people who are foreigners and stuff like that. And so I was a little worried how I would be greeted, but in fact they greeted me through the years consistently with unfailing friendliness and warmth and accessibility. Lesson number one, the people who warn you about, about being shunned because you're a foreigner, they're the ones that are the shunners, you know. And so, but the fiddle players, they always welcomed me. There was only one fiddle player who wouldn't allow us to record. My wife and I visited him, and he liked playing, but he didn't want to record. And he finally confessed that he says, well, I'm afraid that if you record me, you'll never come back. And you know, he was onto something there. That was sort of scary, you know. But they were all friendly. So, but they could sort of relate to the idea that I was documenting. I thought of myself as the documentarian who was going out and documenting culture. They could sort of understand that, but they also quickly figured out that I had played the violin. And so the way they translated it in their mind was, he wants to learn how to play. And so they decided that I was the apprentice and they were the masters. And pretty well they encouraged me to get my own fiddle out and to start relearning in a new style, in a new method of learning from new masters. And it was an experience that changed my life. I'll give you a little vignettes from that experience today and play a few tunes and let you know a little of some of the thoughts that occurred to me as a result of doing it. Now let me sort of warm myself up. Very often when I would visit a fiddler, the first tune they would play would often be a common tune that everybody knows. And it was interesting that they would choose a tune that was sort of an accessible tune first, because it was a way of welcoming the stranger and trying to find common bonds. So surprisingly often I would first get played a tune like Soldier's Joy. I'll play Soldier's Joy now. It's a good tune to warm up my fingers with. A great classic tune of fiddling. It originally shows up in the British Isles in the last half of the 18th century in a few publications by that title, Soldier's Joy, and some other titles as well. It's now, wherever English is spoken and the fiddle is played, Soldier's Joy tends to be part of the repertory. So it shows up in every part of the English-speaking world. And I'll play it more or less in the way I learned it in the Upper South. And in the meantime, hopefully I'll get warmed up. Thank you. I learned fiddle and fiddle tunes from many different people. It was a long and complicated apprenticeship with many masters. I have to say the word master here, by the way. In the generation of fiddlers I was visiting, it was all men. There were no women fiddlers. Well, there was one or two. It wasn't completely unknown, but essentially it was a man's instrument. One of the interesting things in the modern world, it's a sort of an index of the modern world, is the fact that there are now great women fiddlers, and it's cross-cultural. It's in every tradition. In the Upper South, in Irish music, wherever the fiddle is played, this one-time man's instrument is now played by women, and some of the greatest fiddle players now are women. And that's, when we all measure cultural change or cultural progress, a great way to measure it is to step back and look at something like fiddling and to see the change in that as an index of how far we've come. Anyway, my mentor, I had many mentors, but my main mentor was a man named Henry Reed. And Henry Reed, I'll have to tell you a little about him and introduce him to you. And so I think I'll tell about him as he was introduced to me. I was at the Galax Fiddlers Convention in 1966, I think. And I met an old-time fiddler named Oscar Wright. Oscar was from Princeton, West Virginia. And I got to playing with him and listening to him, and he played these wonderful old tunes that nobody else that I knew had played. And so I asked Oscar if I could come and visit him and record him. He said, sure, and he gave me directions, and I came up to Princeton, West Virginia, to record Oscar. He and his son were there. They were both great musicians and played together. He was an old railroad man in his 70s at the time, and he starts playing these great tunes again, and he starts talking about old man Henry Reed, who was the person who taught him these tunes. And when he talked about old man Henry Reed, I pictured this must be somebody that he knew when he was a young person, but who was long since dead. So at some point I said, well, this Henry Reed, he must be long ago dead. Is that right? And Oscar says, oh no, the last I heard, he's still alive. And so I got really excited. I asked for directions, and he gave me directions to where Henry Reed lived in Glen Lynn, Virginia, just across the border from Princeton, where Oscar lived. Glen Lynn is on the New River, right where the New River crosses over from Virginia into West Virginia. And I went to visit Henry Reed. He welcomed me like they always did. And in fact, my wife and I were there together. And so we both came in. They were just sitting down to supper, so they immediately sat us down to supper too. And we ate together and talked. And he asked about the Wrights who had sent him. How's Oscar doing? Is Jean still drinking? And all sorts of questions. But I noticed when Henry Reed had his coffee poured for him at the end of supper that he had a hard time getting it up to his mouth. He had a trimmer in his hand. And, the coffee was sloshing every direction, and I thought, oh my God, this poor man, he might have once been a great fiddle player, but he can't play now. And so by and by, we adjourned into the next room, and out came the fiddle. And I took out the tape recorder, asked if I could record him, and he played a tune. And as he took the bow out, it shook, and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't watch this. This is going to be too awful. But once he started playing, it was magical. It was as if he moved into some other realm from the realm where your hand shakes. And though his hands shook normally, when he played music, it was as if he were a young man again. It was quite an astonishing experience. I've since then talked to a number of doctors about this phenomenon. And this tremor is a tremor that I myself am now getting, so I'm very well aware of it. It operates in the conscious mode. Whenever you're consciously manipulating things, the tremor kicks in. But when you're playing the fiddle, you're not consciously thinking, put down my second finger, now the third finger. In fact, the fiddle tune goes by too fast. And so what you're really doing is thinking the music, and unconsciously, your fingers are doing the right thing. So therefore, the fiddle tune exists in a zone where the palsy has no sway. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Let me play the first tune that Henry Reed played for me. It's a tune that he didn't give a name for, but there's a song that's sort of similar to the first part of it that's called West Virginia Gals. And so we in our band always called it West Virginia Gals. It was a great tune, and I thought at that moment, I knew that I had met my mentor, and I visited Henry Reed maybe 6 or 7 times and recorded him over the next 2 years. He died, or I would have recorded even more. He died in 1968, and he had played for me by that time about 150 different tunes. Many of them were tunes that nobody else in the world played. And I often think of tradition in this case as sort of like an hourglass. And I picture, you know, the funnel coming down to that narrow neck, you know, and then just a few grains of sand, you know, getting through again and then opening up again at the bottom. And that's sort of the way tradition was with Henry Reed and these tunes. He was in many cases the sole carrier of tunes that were once widely known, that were then possessed only by him, and have now gone out again to the world. It's quite a fascinating phenomenon that these tunes are now again part of the repertory of fiddlers throughout the country and even beyond. In fact, one tune that Henry Reed played is so widely disseminated that I'll have to tell you a story about it. My wife and I were in Hungary in 1980, and when we were there, we were visiting with a lot of young people who were recording and apprenticing with old-time musicians in Hungary, the same way that I was in this country. And we sort of spent time with these musicians, and one night we were at a late-night party in Cheep-Cheep, Hungary, southern Hungary, and there was a visiting group who were from France. In fact, they were Breton musicians who were passing through Hungary, and they were playing there, and they were playing at the party. So after the Hungarians played and made music, then the Breton musicians started playing. And at some point, the word went out that I played the fiddle. And so the musicians turned to me very ceremoniously, and they said, "Oh, do you play the fiddle?" And I said, "Yes, I do. And would you like to play a tune?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And so they turned to one another, and I could tell they were sort of thinking, what do we know that the American knows that we can play together? And so they turned back to me and they said, "Do you know Over the Waterfall?" Do I know Over the Waterfall? It was a Henry Reed tune. He was the only person in the world that played Over the Waterfall until I learned it from him. Our band played it Then Henry Reed passed away. We put it out on a little record that we produced in 1968. Then I headed to UCLA for my first job. When I got to UCLA, I was asked to judge the Topanga Canyon Fiddlers Contest, which had been going on for a few years in Los Angeles. And so I agreed to be a judge there. And I get there, and this young fella gets up to play a fiddle tune, and he says, "This tune is called Over the Waterfall, and it's from Henry Reed via Alan Jabbour." And so he didn't know that I was sitting there judging him. So the interesting highways and byways of culture. So here's Over the Waterfall. Thanks. Well, let's talk a little about what fiddle tunes are for. I'm a folklorist, and unfortunately, when you're a folklorist, people think you know answers to things that they've always wondered about. And so one question that I often get is a question having to do with the function of fiddle tunes. What are fiddle tunes for? How do they function in the community that plays them? And so I'd like to talk a little about the various functions of fiddle tunes and play some tunes to illustrate it. The first function is obviously to dance with. You know, fiddle tunes are used for dancing, and the modern repertory of fiddling is a repertory that really arose in the later 18th century in the English-speaking world. It was a kind of a revolutionary new repertory that swept the English-speaking world in the late 18th century. It started in the British Isles, to be sure, but it was really happening in the what is now the United States, as early as it was happening in the British Isles itself. So, though I started my quest for fiddling thinking of the British tunes as the ancestors and the American tunes as the descendants, in fact, I learned gradually that they were more like cousins to each other. Like the Scottish tunes were part of that same revolution of the last half of the 18th century. The Irish tunes were part of that revolution. The tunes of New England, the tunes of the Appalachians, each of these areas went through this revolution, but each one sort of went through it and it took on its local color and character. And I'll talk more about that later when I talk about the upland South style. But that was what I came to realize I was documenting when I documented these fiddling traditions. And of course it was a revolution in part in dance. There were new forms of dance. One of them in particular was the Hornpipe, which was a sort of a solo fancy dance. And when I played Soldier's Joy a while ago, if you saw it in a tune book, it would look like this. And each of those phrases goes, you go daddle, 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 lum, pum, pum. Well, that actually is the dancer's fancy footworks. The dancer goes chugga, 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 chum, chum, chum. And the tune echoes or prompts, you might say, the dance. So the hornpipe was one form of dance, and it ushered in an era of not just of community dancing. Dance, of course, is the old metaphor for community. When you have a square dance, you're in effect representing in sort of moving terms a community together, working together. But the solo fancy dance also highlighted individuals, and in a way it represented the highlighting of individuals more and more, beginning in the 18th century and coming on down to the present. The famous soft shoe routines of the earlier 20th century are really historically connected to those early hornpipes that were kicked out of the late 18th century and swept along by the fiddle, the new modern violin, the European violin, which sort of swept across the backcountry of America as fast as anything cultural ever sweeps across anything. It was quite astonishing how quickly it happened. Anyway, dance is the first function, and Henry Reed played for dances himself, and he used to talk about dancers. I can remember him talking about this tune, which he called "This is the Old Jawbones," and he says, I can remember Old Man Carr listening to that, and he says, play me the old jawbones and I'll get up and dance it. And Henry Reed said he had these big old heavy shoes, you know, and he described these shoes carefully, and he says, play me the jawbones and I'll get up and dance it. By God, I'll dance it, you know. And so he played jawbones for me, and as he did, I saw that he was playing for me the documentarian. We were just sitting in his living room, but in fact he was envisioning the tune doing its cultural work in the community, and he could picture Old Man Carr dancing as he played. So let me play the jawbones that Henry Reed played. So dance is one function of fiddle tunes, but another function, and a very interesting one, is marches. The tune I just played, I think, is one of the tunes that Henry Reed learned from an old man when he was a kid. And this old man was named Quince Dillion. He was born in 1810 in Southside, Virginia, moved up into the mountains with his family in 1820 or so. Lived on the Appalachian frontier in the early days. Played the fiddle, played the fife too, and played the fife with the local militia. You know, you had fife and drum corps that were used with the local militia, and Quince Dillion was a fife player, and he was a fifer in the Mexican War. So he went off to Mexico and played tunes there. He came back, he actually was, as an old man, he was a fifer in the Civil War. And as a really old man, he taught Henry Reed how to play tunes. He was actually as old as 90 when he finally passed away after teaching Henry Reed as a kid. So it's kind of, you know, when we think of history, we often think of it in periods, and when you think of it as in periods, you have to peel your way back, you know. And I can remember in 8th grade American history, or whenever it was, reading about, maybe it was 11th grade American history, reading about Jacksonian democracy, you know. Boy, that sounds like a long time ago, Jacksonian democracy. But, you know, there was only one person between Quince Dillion, who was a product of Jacksonian democracy, if ever there was one, and me, you know. And that one person between the two of us was Henry Reed. And it's a good lesson because it reminds us that tradition isn't just generation to generation. Very often it leaps generations. Very often old people teach young people, and it jumps over 1 or 2 generations in the process. And the transmission is a very complicated process. In fact, with fiddling, very often father to son is not the most comfortable way to go. I have a son myself, and I know why. Father to son is a little too close for comfort there. You guys, you maybe understand what I'm talking about there. And the poor kid needs his own space. But grandfather to grandson, now that works just fine. And uncle, no problem. Neighbor, great. And that's the way fiddling works. Anyway, Quince Dillion, the local fiddler in the old days was often also the fifer. You know, we read again in books, and we read about the fifer. We think that's one person, and then elsewhere we're reading about the fiddler playing at dances, and we think that's another person, but actually it's the same person. Quince Dillion was both a fiddler and a fifer. He taught Henry Reed this tune called Santa Anna's Retreat, which he said he learned when he was in the Mexican War, and he played it for Henry Reed, and Henry Reed played it for me, and Henry Reed said, now this is the tune the Santa Anna's army used when they retreated from the Americans. And so he plays it, and I listened, and of course this was my mentor, and so I was very dutifully nodding and worshipful, but in my heart I doubted because it sounded to me like an Irish air, you know. And I thought to myself, how could the Mexican army be playing an Irish air as they retreat from the Americans? But I learned it anyway, and I played it, and I told that very story to another audience, and at the end, you know, I allowed questions. I shouldn't have done that, you know, but I allowed questions, and so this fellow says, excuse me, he says, you know, there was a large number of Irish who immigrated to Mexico, and they were part of the Mexican army. And so I said, oh. And so I tell you now this story just by way of letting you remember that when you study history, it's always more complicated than you think. You know? So, and that's the way it was in this case, too. It's a great tune, though, so let me play Santa Anna's Retreat. So I've named dance and I've named marching as two functions of fiddle tunes. But I describe them as two, but actually, maybe we should think of them as one. Is marching a form of dancing? Think about it. You know, I asked this question to a group of people at a dance conference, and they said, "Oh no." But for the life of them, they couldn't come up with any reason why it wasn't. And so I'm sort of stuck on this idea now that marching can be thought of as a form of dancing. Anyway, onward to the next function of fiddle tunes, which is art for art's sake. Now you might think, well, fiddlers aren't into art for art's sake, but you're wrong. Henry Reed, when Oscar Wright first heard Henry Reed play, he tells this story. He says, well, I was going to tell this story earlier, and I got distracted with another story. He said, a bunch of us young fellas were going to play at a dance, and we thought we were hot stuff, you know. And he says, and he had his railroad cap on and everything. And he said, this fella came in, he was older than us, and he was in overalls, and he sort of looked like a hayseed. Oscar thought of himself as a railroad man being very cosmopolitan, you see. And so he says, we noticed he was carrying a sack over his shoulder. And we said, hey, fella, what's that in your sack? And he says, well, I got a fiddle in there. They nudged each other. He's got a fiddle. Well, let's see that fiddle. And so Henry Reed takes it out, and they said, say, can you play that fiddle? And Henry Reed says, well, I reckon I can. So he takes out the fiddle, and he starts playing. Oscar says, I listened. He says, I took my fiddle, and I just quietly snuck it down into the case and shoved it under the table. And he says, and I spent the rest of that night listening to Henry Reed play the fiddle. Oscar says, he'd get you up close. He says, make the hair stand up right on top of your head. And when he talked about making the hair stand on top of his head, in essence, he was talking about the aesthetic response, I think. I think most of us recognize that idea. And that was Oscar's idea, too. And this was about art for art's sake. And some of the tunes are not even danceable tunes. There's many tunes that I play that I learned from Henry Reed, but I never played for a dance. Some of them are irregular. They couldn't be played for a dance because dances call for a regular number of beats, especially square dances or other dances that have group participation. So these irregular, oddball, crooked tunes, they're sometimes called crooked by fiddlers. These crooked tunes are played because they're wonderful. They're not played because they're useful. They're not useful, they're beautiful. So, beautiful is useful, absolutely. Here's a tune that Henry Reed played as crooked as anything. And when he first played it for me, he couldn't remember the name of it. And so I took it back, and he said he thought he learned it from this fellow who had been down in Texas. So when I taught it to our band, we ended up talking about the tune from the guy from Texas. And it got shortened down, and it became Texas. And so this tune got named Texas. We actually put it on our little record that we made in 1968 and sent it out to the world that way, called Texas. Meanwhile, I went back to Henry Reed, and he plays the tune again. And I said, what's the name of that tune? And he says, oh, that's Newcastle. And I said, uh-oh, too late. You know. So here's the tune. It's called Newcastle, and it's also out and about as Texas. Another function of fiddle tunes is cultural commemoration. In an oral tradition, you devise ways of remembering things, of honoring and commemorating things, and naming a tune after a notable place or event is a great way of commemorating it. It sort of says, this is important in our life. And this works very well for history. There's a number of tunes that are commemoration of history. I'll play a tune. I'll retune the fiddle for this one. This is a tune called Bonaparte's Retreat. A well-known, a classical fiddle tune in America. Again, probably an Irish air originally, but sort of recast as a march in America, mainly in the Appalachian South, and still popular as a fiddle tune. And then a song got made about it by Pee Wee King in about 1950, and the song got then re-recorded by K-Star in a sort of an uptown version. And so the ripples of Bonaparte's Retreat go on and on. One version of it was recorded by Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress, and then got transcribed by Ruth Crawford Seeger, Charles Seeger's wife, and a composer in her own right, the mother of Mike Seeger and Peggy Seeger and some of the other Seegers. Anyway, I'm getting lost in this story. I'm telling you too many facts. That's the problem. The transcription appeared in the Lomax book, Our Singing Country, and Aaron Copland saw it there, and he was writing some music for the ballet Rodeo. And so he did the hoedown based on this Bonaparte's Retreat that was transcribed from the recording of an Eastern Kentucky fiddle player, Bill Stepp. And that recording found its way then into the classical repertory, but not only that, the hoedown from Rodeo is now played all the time on television as a TV ad, and you know, you hear a fellow intoning beef, it's what's for dinner or something, you know, and the orchestra is playing their knockoff, you might say, of Bill Stepp's old-time fiddle tune version of Bonaparte's Retreat. Well, I'm not doing Bill Stepp's version, I'm doing a different version, which was more or less adapted from Henry Reed. go back to where it was before, and it just tried to go back to where it was. Sorry, guys. Yeah, retuning is still fairly widespread in old-time fiddling in the Upper South. It once was widespread in Europe as well. A lot of the court musicians retuned their orchestras, retuned their violins when they were playing in different keys, and the retuning helps to play in different keys more with greater facility, you might say. But actually the fiddlers augment that when you talk to them. They say, yes, it's easier to play that tune when it's retuned, but also it makes a different sound. So again, we're into art here, you know, and the different sound qualities are important to them, and that's why they do it, not just because it's easier. Tunes in commemoration of history, Bonaparte's Retreat is a good example of that. There are also tunes in commemoration of places. And I'm going to play now a tune that commemorates a creek. Many of the tunes in the Appalachian region are named after creeks and rivers. And why are they named after creeks and rivers? That's what people keep asking me. I've got to come up with something. And so, well, I think, for one thing, a fiddle tune has motion like a creek in a river, and there's something about fiddle tunes and about creeks and rivers that's sort of similar in some deeper spiritual way. But for another thing, I noticed this when I was hanging out with Burl Himmons, a fiddle player in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Burl he would describe their going out hunting. He says, well, we were going out hunting and we went back up over, they didn't say we went down to the fork in the road and turned left and, you know, by the church or anything. They said, well, we went back over Black Mountain and we came back down into the North Fork of Cranberry, and we followed Cranberry up a ways, and then we got to Kins Creek, and then we went back up Kins Creek, and I realized that their whole way of envisioning this arterial network that connected them to the world was creeks and rivers. And so it wasn't just that creeks and rivers are pretty burbling things that are nice to commemorate in fiddle tunes. It's that was their network connecting them to the world. So anyway, let me play a tune and another tuning. You'll notice that it has a different ring to it. This is a tune called Three Forks of Cheep. Cheep River is a river that rises in east central West Virginia, and it flows northward. Ultimately, it becomes part of the Monongahela and flows into Pittsburgh and becomes part of the Ohio and starts working its way down to the Gulf of Mexico again. But in West Virginia, it flows northward, and it's one of those. There's a number of rivers in the world. I grew up on the St. Johns River in Jacksonville, Florida. If you grow up on a river that flows north, you think it's the only river in the world that flows north. That's what we thought about the St. Johns. Yes, it's the only river that flows north, we used to say. And that's what they say about the Cheep River. I don't know, we didn't stop to think about, the Nile, for example. Anyway, here's Three Forks of Cheep. By gosh, it does sound like a fiddle, like a creek. And I'll move on to another function of the fiddle tune. And that is as a cultural expression. One of the interesting things that I came to realize about the tunes that I was learning is that they carried with them, in effect, the record of human interaction. And one of the fascinating things about folk music, and particularly about fiddle music, is that it's not just an expression of people, it's also a way of interconnecting with other people. Fiddle tunes are used as a way of communicating across group lines. This fiddling style that arose in the Upper South in the late 18th, early 19th century wasn't just created by white fiddlers. In fact, we know from the documentary record that there was about equal parts of white and black fiddlers in the Upper South in the early 19th century. And we also know that there was interaction between the white and black musicians, that in effect, they were going through this revolution, creating this revolutionary new style of music together. And thus, it's not surprising that just as the Irish version of the revolution came out with the sort of special ethnic imprint of that area, and the Scottish version had its ethnic imprint, so the version of the revolution that emerged from the Upper South had its special imprint that reflected the people who participated in it. And the great melodic tradition was certainly British in origin. However, one of the fascinating things about fiddling in the Upper South is that it's full of syncopation. And syncopation, when you hear it, it's not just something that's sort of added in it's not just local color. You know, it's in fact integrated fundamentally into the way you play, so that you can't not do it. You know, if you don't do it, you're not speaking the dialect correctly. And so it's fascinating to see these patterns of syncopation, very complicated syncopated patterns sort of embedded in the bowing style of the fiddling. Let me play a tune, a simple and well-known tune all through the South, Old Joe Clark. I'll play it once through just as a tune, and then if you'll allow me, I'll go back and sort of do an explication de text here. And pick it apart and show you how you can see in this one tune, you know, many of the contributing cultural components of the new style that emerged in the South. So. Even when you're indulgent, I ought to tune up. now we'll go back and start picking it apart here. The main thing that I'll illustrate here, and you'll have to take my word for it, that it really appears throughout the fiddling of this region, that it's really embedded in my style. I can't not do this kind of syncopation, but let me illustrate how it works. It's essentially drawing the bow in groups of notes. You know, you can play each note as a separate stroke of the bow, like. There, I'm playing a different stroke of the bow for each note, or you can group the notes together. I'm doing 2 to a bow stroke, right? You with me? Okay, all right. Or I could even do 4. So, but that's all, how shall I say, 4 square, right? But what the fiddlers of the Upper South do, and they do it consistently from Virginia to Texas, including the old people like Henry Reed who learned their style before the turn of the century. What they do is this complicated bowing pattern where they group the bow into groups of 3 and 2, so that a group of 8 would be divided up not into 2s and 4s, but into, say, 3, 3, and 2. 3, 6, 8. So you could do. There's 3 separate, and then 3 slurred, and then 2 separate. It's subtle, it sort of goes by fast, but what it does, in effect, is create this pattern. Grouping things into 3s and 2s creates not just syncopation generically, but a certain particular kind of syncopation, and it's the kind of syncopation that we now associate with American music generally. Most people, when they hear it, they think, well, it must be African American, and maybe it came from jazz, or maybe from blues, or maybe real old time stuff like ragtime. Actually, it did come from African Americans. It's clearly an African American contribution to the style, but it came even earlier by a century. It came in the early 19th century, and it came in fiddling in the Upper South. And it worked its way from fiddling out into other kinds of folk music in the South, and ultimately into popular music, beginning in waves with the minstrel stage and going right on through the various waves of the 20th century. So this syncopation that's now associated with American music on a worldwide basis really, I believe, began with fiddling shared by black and white together in the Upper South as they, through art, forged a unified culture that connected them together. It's an amazing thing that they did that, considering the things that kept them apart. It's clear that art was the one area where they were experimenting with symbolizing their living together on this land. Now, there's a hint that there might be another cultural contribution there too, and so we might as well talk about it along with the syncopation from African American fiddlers is clear. But there's another possible contribution that's not provable, but I've still got to share it to you as a thought. These fiddle tunes that I'm playing, if you notice, they usually have 2 parts, like Old Joe Clark. Good. There's the first part, and then you repeat it. And then there's a second part. And then you repeat it. And you go back to the beginning again. right? Okay, now that's the classic pattern in the English-speaking world for a fiddle tune. 2 parts, each part repeated, and then you go back to the beginning again when you're through. But the typical tune in the English-speaking world, in this revolution that occurred in the late 18th century, starts on the low part. And the low part is sort of the most important part. And you hear the low part, and then it has a second part, which is the high part. And the high part it's ideally, it might be equally important, but very often it's more like the filler part, you know? And so the low part is the important part. And so the contour of it is it starts down here and it goes up and it comes down and up again. And then it goes to the high part and then back down to the low part again. Okay? A few tunes in, say, Ireland or Scotland or England or New England contradict that pattern. A few of them start in the lower part, but basically the pattern is you start in the top, start in the bottom. Only in the Upper South do you have a large class of tunes, hundreds of tunes, really thousands of tunes, that start at the very top. They start at the top and they sort of cascade down like those creeks and rivers we were talking about. The first part starts at the top and cascades down, then it repeats and cascades down. And then the lower part is down here. It might rise up a little and goes back down again, and then again down. So the basic pattern is top to bottom, cascading down. And this is a very striking thing because it doesn't occur really in the other parts of the English-speaking world. So why do they do it? Basically, there's 2 possibilities. Either they made it up, you know, or which is sort of the last refuge of people who can't figure anything out. Well, they must have made it up, you know. So, or else they got it from somebody. So, but who did they get it from? It's not really British or European, because typical British folk tunes and European folk tunes start at the bottom and rise up and then drop again. In theory, you could say, well, maybe it's West African, but that's not really typical of African music, too. Again, you could find it there, but it wouldn't be what you would call your classic West African tune to start at the top and sort of cascade down to the very bottom of a wide vocal range. But there actually is one cultural region of the world that does tunes like that, and that is American Indians, particularly of the eastern woodlands and the plains. They do these tunes, most of them that start at the very top and sort of cascade down. So either the fiddle players just went and made it up, not knowing that they happened to have just overlapped with, ousted, but also intermarried with American Indians, or else they got that idea from American Indian music. Can't prove it, but I've got to put it out there for you to think about, you know. So when you hear these tunes that start at the very top and go down, go and listen to a recording of an Indian powwow and see if you don't hear tunes that are exactly like it. Well, I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I've already talked longer than I should have. I'll maybe play one more tune, and then I'll take any questions you have. And afterwards, when we're through with questions for the group, you can come up afterwards and I'll talk to you one-on-one. And there's a few records over here if anybody's curious to hear records, not just of my fiddling, but of wonderful fiddling from the Upper South and from America in general, records that I edited for the Library of Congress. And I'd be happy to share them with you. And let me close out for now by playing a tune from a classic tune, fiddle tune of the old frontier called Forked Deer. It's a great tune of the Upper South, not known really outside the Upper South. You could hear it as far west as Missouri and Texas, but pretty well it's the Upper South where Forked Deer is played. And of course, forked must refer to the antlers of the deer, so it evokes for me the old frontier. But then I was surprised one day when I was picturing the forked deer with its antlers racing through the wilderness, and I came across a map in West Tennessee that there's a river called the Forked Deer River. I thought, oh my gosh, it wasn't a forked deer after all. It was a river. But maybe the river was named after the forked deer, and then the fiddle tune was named after the river. But then something in me, the art for art's sake part of me, rebelled at that. And I thought, well, fiddle tunes don't have to be named after rivers. Maybe the river was named after the fiddle tune. And so I like that idea. So. Starts at the top and drops down to the bottom. Has syncopation in it. Good tune of the old frontier. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Any questions? Yes.
How is it that the tones that you're playing on the fiddle are so different from the tones you hear in the classical violin?
Well,
Can you note the same
I'll-
tune
I will.
differently?
he asks, how is it that the tone that I produce on the fiddle is so different from classical violin? And especially since, as I've told you, I started out playing classical violin myself. Well, it did really take relearning. I mean, you had to sort of rethink the whole art from ground zero. For me, I had the capability in my fingers and bow arm, but I really had to learn the art. And part of it is how you, any fiddle player, including Isaac Stern, will tell you that the soul of the instrument is in the bow. This looks flashy, you know, with the fingers dancing around and everything, but this is really the mechanical part, roughly speaking, compared to the bow production. And it's the way you do bowing patterns, as I was discussing with the syncopation, but also it's the way you produce. Very often classical players are taught to play with continuous, I mean, they have an aesthetic of continuous sound, you know, like when I was playing Soldier's Joy, I played, and then I illustrated to you how, if you read it in the book, it would be. Now the classical player would play it the way I just did, with more even production. The sound is less rhythmic and more melodic sounding. It's not impact fiddling. It's every note. You know, whereas the fiddler. It's still playing notes, but it's doing it in a rhythmic way, where impact is instead of sustained sound is really the goal. So I think that makes the difference that you're hearing. Okay?
You say
Yes,
a
Ed.
fiddle player like Isaac Stern. I've never heard of him refer to the fiddle player.
Yeah, he would.
Is the term interchangeable for you?
Yeah, the term is interchangeable. I suppose in modern American English, we think of violin as a little more formal, and we think of fiddle as more informal. But a lot of people also think of fiddle playing as equals this style of playing, and violin equals Isaac Stern. But the truth is that if Isaac Stern were being interviewed for PBS, or if the cameras were rolling in the back of the room, he would say, my violin, you know. But if he kicked off his shoes and popped a beer, you know, and you're sitting in the TV room together and talking, he'd talk about my fiddle, you know. So he would use the same two terms, one informally and one formally. And so really, they're two words for the same critter. And some people use fiddle to mean folk style. But the truth is that a lot of the folk fiddlers say violin, you know, especially if they're talking to a documentarian from the Library of Congress, you know. So, you know.
If I could just follow up with that, you talked about the impact of the Appalachian Mountains, but they don't stop at the upper south, they go on up.
Yeah.
What about the fiddle playing in New England?
Yeah, it's an important style, but it's a different style. It regionally formed in that same period, but it's different from, they're all related cousins, as I said, but, and you can go on into Canada and you encounter this amazing style that's played all through Eastern Canada. It's often associated with the French Canadians, but the truth is, it's as much Irish as it is French. And it too is a sort of a new consolidated tradition, you know, by, you know, mixing of different cultural groups together. And they've come up with this new sort of Canada style of playing that's very characteristic of that part of the English-speaking world. Yes?
You made some references to West Virginia, where I am a native, and I went to WVU. Patrick Gaynor was my, have you heard of him?
Yeah, sure, I met him.
Okay, and because it was very important to him to go over the state and try to make all these recordings of the fiddlers to try to capture that before they were all gone.
Patrick Gaynor was one of an earlier generation of West Virginia professors who went around documenting folk culture in the state. And he really did wonderful things through his work, his teaching and his documentation. And also he started the Glenville Folk Festival as a sort of a state festival to feature West Virginia music. So he had many contributions to, so I was of the younger generation, and you know, of course, us younger generation people think that, you know, those old guys, they did their stuff, but we're going to really do it. You know? Now I'm the old guy, you know, and the younger generation, there's people here who are part of that younger generation and who are doing great work in places like West Virginia now, and I'm just sort of thrilled and awed by their work. They're carrying on in the same way. In a way, we've discovered or invented an amazing thing, I think, in the 20th century. It started in the 19th century. Documenting we thought of originally as something that's apart from culture, like it's a process to document culture and carry it somewhere else. But without realizing it, we've turned documentation into part of the process of culture itself. And we now document, documentation is in fact part of the cultural process. And recording people is part of learning now, and I go around and teach, and people learn from me directly in a workshop, but they also record me, and they take it back home and listen. They send it to their friends, and this is a worldwide phenomenon. You know, the world may not have electricity and computers, but I guarantee you, you know, there isn't a tribe in the Amazon that doesn't have cassette recorders. You know, so it's become very much part of the cultural process itself, you know, and I think that's an amazing and interesting development. And the Patrick Gaynors of the world, you might say, showed us the way. So, any other questions? Hey, you guys have been a great audience. Thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Jabbour, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And you
A little feedback again. Let me come to this side of you here. and say thank you again to you for this wonderful presentation. We really are lucky in having people such as you and the experts you mentioned that you learned from, who have documented our heritage and are able to pass it on from one generation to another and to share it with us here at the Barnes & Noble tonight. I'd like to thank you for coming out. I'd like to acknowledge Dr.